Okay, the next presentation is Andy Bubb, establishing the Environmental Assessment Framework and National Network of Monitoring Sites. Andy.
Thanks very much for that, Steve. So, yeah, I'm going to speak about how we've established the environmental monitoring and how the monitoring across a whole range of different factors. So that includes the social impacts, media and those type things, and then the environmental impacts as well. Just to give you an idea, the MERI group, which I work with, there's two components to that, the on-ground monitoring group and the feral camel geodatabase group. And I think where it sits in the project structure is important to recognise. It feeds directly into the National Operations Group, and the members of the MERI group, they do move across those other parts of the project. So, for instance, Glenn Edwards, who's on the group, is part of the National Operations Group and the Steering Committee. So it helps keep what we're doing very realistic and grounded in what can be achieved during the project. Kevin Williams is here, he's the chair of the group. The past chair was Craig James. Mark Lethbridge, Jane Brimbox, Quentin Hart, Les Russell, Brad Page and Peter C. were all members of the MERI group as well. So it was a really good group for directing what we were going to do and working out how we were going to monitor the outcomes of the Australian Feral Camel Management Project. So to go back to the first principles of it, the objectives that we had from the Australian government were about reducing the densities to protect identified refuges for biodiversity. To protect wetlands was the second one, and that was probably something which, while it was included in or recognised in the initial stages of the project, it probably became a lot more important and really was a really clear way that we could demonstrate what the impacts of the feral camels were on the landscape and on these really high value areas. Jane Brimbox and Jenny Davis are here today, and they've done a huge amount of work in Central Australia and remote Australia looking at the impact on water, and I think it tells the story of how camels do make an impact on the land. And the third one was improved soil management on pastoral properties. So at the start of the project, I don't expect people to read through all of that diagram, but it was basically there was a really extensive MERI plan that was established, and there was a really solid program logic that was set up. And what that did at the start of the project, it was a really extensive process, but it gave us a really good foundation for then basing the rest of the MERI plan off. And what this was boiled down to was 26 measures that could be enacted on the ground. So in terms of what we were really, once we went through the big process of really including everything, we then took it back to say, well what improves as the feral camels are removed? And I hope it shows up on the screen, but up in the top, there's three photos there. The first one, that's the dark one, you can see a dingo that's sitting on the back of a camel. And so what you're witnessing is Australia's biggest predator attacking a camel. Sorry, it's not actually attacking it, it's simply sitting on its back. They're not moving, they're not worried by it, and I think it really does emphasise that, you know, the landscape out there, there's nothing that's really going to harm the camels. In the lower photo, you can see the dingo going past, and again, it just really highlights the size difference, and in fact, there is a collar on that camel in the bottom photo. So how Mark Lethbridge and Nick Seckham got the camel to pose for the photo, we're not sure, but I think it was a really great photo. In the other side, you can see the browse line, and Catherine Nano, who's in the audience, she's of normal height, and so you can see that browse line is really high, and that's not too far away from Uluru, where that photo was taken. And so when camels move through the landscape in big numbers, you can see that there is a pretty dramatic impact. These are the assets, and when we were looking at these and trying to work out how the monitoring would be established, one of the big factors is simply the scale. When you look at how far apart those assets are, how long it takes to drive or fly to get from one side to the other, when you then try to put that into a framework of how regularly you're able to visit and take the measurements that are needed, it starts to become pretty challenging. The other thing that's important to note is that we're working across different jurisdictions. So within different states and the territory, there's different government arrangements, involvement of different departments. So it was something which we dealt with, and maybe at the start you'd think that by having botanists in every state and territory and environment departments and the same positions in each of the areas working on the project might work. That wasn't the case, and I think it actually became one of the strengths of the project. It gave us some flexibility about how we did things. So the MERI, the monitoring, evaluation, review and improvement components, they were spread across these measures that are up on the screen there. And basically, that was to cover off on all of the things that was basically as a return to the Australian government, to the nation, as a result of the investment in this project. The photo there is from Jigalong in Western Australia. That's a really, that waterhole's quite close to the community. That's somewhere where kids go swimming in, and there was, a few years ago, quite a few dead camels in that area. So there was a direct impact on people not being able to use that when it's really hot. Obviously, people like to go for a swim. Feral camels had a really big impact on that. So it's not, I think it was important to recognise that the impact of feral camels wasn't just something that was passive. It did affect people's day-to-day lives. I'm not sure what that previous slide was. This is the middle point of the slides for today, so I just thought I'd put this one in. It's a cheeky looking camel. I'm really not sure what happened when the person walked around the front of the car to get into the passenger seat. I'm sure they got a bit of a surprise to see the camel squatting down at the side there. I think Tim censored me on some of these slides. Once we've gone now to look into the environmental impact, this is a slide that Jane Brimbox will go into in more detail later on. But I think it's important to understand that density is really where the damage comes from. So knowing the absolute number of feral camels, apart from it being incredibly difficult, it's the density that they're in is where the damage really comes about. So what you can see on this slide is that across the top here, we've got, as the density increases from the 0.1 up to the 1s and 2s, which we did have, which did occur, you can see that the top graph indicates the percentage of plants that were browsed. So at very low density, there was less than 10% of them that were browsed, but once you moved into those high densities, there was up to 80% of the population. So if there was 100 trees, up to 80 of them had been browsed. Where the rubber really hits the road with this graph, though, is the second graph. It shows the percentage of branches that were browsed per shrub. So at low densities, it was a leaf here and there, but when we moved to those high densities, it was up to potentially 50% of the branches were browsed. So when you consider that, you know, leaves are important for photosynthesising and those type things, and half of those are gone, in a harsh environment like, you know, desert Australia, the feral camels can have a really significant impact. And this graph is really goes to the core of the density issue and the impact of feral camels on vegetation. These are just some other great photos that were collected using the remote cameras, and they were a really important part of the project. We were able to collect some really great images in terms of the wedgie in the corner there, the dingo. We were also able to capture what happens when large numbers of feral camels move into a waterhole, when the water runs out, and the slow demise that they go through. And they were pretty dramatic and tragic images. So it really was a case of using the cameras, we were able to understand what occurs when we're not there. Land management and changing land management practices was an important component of the project. The target that we had within the project was to get 12 land managers across 90,000 square kilometres, or managing an area of 90,000 square kilometres, to adopt new management practices. So 90,000 square kilometres, I looked at some figures last night to try and get you some context. The ACT is 2,300 square kilometres. Tasmania is 90,000 square kilometres. So by influencing 12 managers that manage that area, it's pretty substantial. In the end, we had it was 172,000 square kilometres being managed by 44 different landholders that changed their management practices. So it was a pretty significant outcome. The capacity building and public support was a really important component of the project, and I think that from the presentations that we've seen so far, that does demonstrate that it is across a range of stakeholders, and the success of the project does come from working with everyone that's engaged in or has an interest in feral camel management. So in the photos we've got there, the guy squatting down is Professor Don Waller from the US, and he's done a huge amount of work on large ungulate browsing, and looked especially at deer, but also at elephants and other things in Africa. He came out and spent a couple of days with us and was able to really give us some great insight into the impacts of browsing. So Jane will go further into that later on. Capacity building also involved commercial use training and those type of things, and Phil G, who's here, has done a lot with that. And there was also capacity building in training people up to conduct monitoring of water holes and vegetation and those type of things. Another thing we looked at was the infrastructure damage that occurs. And I suppose that the image there This one up in the top corner, that's from Curtin Springs, and Lindy will talk about that later on. But again, it goes back to the fact that with large numbers of feral camels around, there is a really big impact, and it can't be ignored. It's not a passive impact. This light here, it looks relatively insignificant, but it is on a landing strip at a remote community. So when that's knocked out, you potentially then don't have the ability to get aircraft in overnight, and that may be the flying doctor or something like that. So infrastructure damage was something else which we looked at and quantified through some surveys with pastoralists and conservation land managers, and also with Aboriginal community members. The vehicle damage in the bottom corner there, the occupants were okay, but there is a pretty pronounced hump hole in the middle of the windscreen. So feral camels being out there can have a pretty significant impact. The compliance with the standard operating procedures was something else which we looked at, and we'll be reporting on back to the Australian Government. And that covers all aspects of the project, including the commercial use with its multiple stages of, or multiple processes. So that's the mustering, animals in the yard, and the transport. And then the aerial culling was another big component where we looked at the compliance with the standard operating procedure, and Bitter will be talking about that further. Communication and extension was a important part of what we're reporting back to the Australian Government. The number of written products, that's being finalised at the moment. Finalised kind of this week, I suppose. The number of media articles, when I prepared the presentation, we had 283. I think Jan's significantly contributed to that in the last couple of days. So we'll be looking at that. The number of training sessions, there was about 500 rangers and traditional owners that were involved in training with monitoring, ground control, culling and those type of things. So the number of training sessions was a really important component of the project, and it was a great success in engagement, but also helped us to refine what we were doing on the monitoring front. Again, this is just about the communication. So the Feral Camels website was a good source of information, along with Feral Scan, the camel scan, where the public could report where they'd spotted feral camels, and it was a good kind of public engagement tool. So just to finish off, to talk about the improvements that we undertook during the project, during the MERI process. Initially, we looked to have probably a smaller team that was experienced in vegetation analysis or water analysis, monitoring, those type of things. And probably what we found was that no individual had all the answers, in that it was only when we got everyone together from Western Australia, Northern Territory, South Australia and Queensland that we were able to get a full picture of what was going on. And definitely as a result of those processes, we came up with a better monitoring methodology that was then implemented. Another improvement was, a big challenge at the start of the project was trying to understand how we were going to fit monitoring into the time frame of the project. So with a 4-year project, with the droughts, the really wet times, the growth events and those type of things that occur, trying to tease out what the camel impacts were was one of the challenges. And that's where we had to adopt different processes, including building up, looking at water holes and what the impact was there. So essentially what we were basically saying was the timeframes are always going to be tight, and you just have to work with it. The continued collaboration building was another really important component of the project. We did that through regular updates with the steering committee, the MERI group, and also making sure that the people that were involved in the on-the-ground monitoring were in regular contact. And it really did mean that problems were solved a whole lot faster. And another improvement, that initially what we were setting out to do was look at the impact of feral camels. But what was recognised was that by looking at, by modifying the methodologies, but without compromising, the camel monitoring in any way, we were able to create some pretty impressive data sets that will have an enduring benefit to other projects. So we've got some great baseline data now from the 120, 130 vegetation sites that have been monitored. In the Northern Territory alone, I think there was about 60 water holes that there was data collected on. So there's some pretty good data sets now that have been great for looking at the impact of feral camels, but there'll be enduring benefit beyond the project which is great for the return on the investment. That's it. Thanks, Steve.